Hello, my name is Olivia Snyder, and I'm a potter, painter, and maker. What's going on today? Today, I'm building some tiny fairy houses. The clay I'm working with comes from Armadillo clay in Austin, Texas, and it's called Longhorn White. It is a low-fire clay, firing from cones 04 to 06. For glazes, most of what's in my supply inventory are Mayco low-fire glazes. I find they're predictable and great for doing a lot of decorative work. One of the most common questions I get when I'm at shows is, how long have you been doing this? It's one of those questions where I get that little hourglass cursor icon just kind of spinning above my head while I look for a suitable response. How long for what? Making art? Making pottery? Doing shows? Being weird? What? Typically, I land on the safe and appropriate response of, oh, I've been making pottery for a little over 15 years now. I've been making art since before I could pick up a crayon. I waffle between throwing clay or hand building being my favorite. Throwing clay on the wheel is incredibly meditative and satisfying. You get to put on music and just revel in the push-pull of trying to get a heap of mud to resemble this perfect vessel. And hand building is where I get to hunch over my work table like a wet dirt goblin and poke and prod things with sticks until I've formed something that's kind of nifty. Both have their appeal. I originally got into pottery when I applied for a job at Color Me Mine, which is known as a paint-your-own pottery studio. Apparently they are huge in California. Basically, folks walk in, they pick out a white, once-fired piece of pottery called bisque, and they get to paint all over it with glazes, and they come back a week later to pick up their new, shiny, brightly colored artwork. This type of pottery is what is called slip cast. Each shape has a plaster mold that liquid clay is poured into. After waiting a little while, the clay is removed and you're left with the shape of a cat or a mug or whatever the mold was. Clay usually goes through two firings, a bisque fire, which hardens the clay, and then the glaze fire, which matures the clay and makes all the previously chalky glaze all nice and shiny and brilliant. Back in the 70s, this was a fairly popular thing to do, except studios would actually pour the liquid clay into molds and do the first firing themselves. Nowadays, most studios ship in bisque or the once-fired clay. It's a lot more sturdy than greenware. That's what we call the pieces that come directly out of the molds. People would come into the studio, clean up the greenware, sometimes paint directly on it. Very often we would get older ladies come into the studio and they would reminisce about going to their own paint-your-own pottery studio back in the 70s to paint something. And it honestly was really heartwarming to watch folks like these bring their grandkids in to paint pottery and share that experience. I think my favorite part of that job was when people would come to pick their stuff up. Most pottery glazes are really dull and have weird colors before they're fired in the kiln. We had a display that was just a rainbow of glazes for people to choose from, and they all had these little fired samples right next to the bottle so that you could see what the finished result is ideally going to look like. For example, if you wanted to pick a bright cherry red, it looked really dull and kind of pinkish before firing. So people would leave their paintings with us. They'd look chalky and washed out and kind of blah. And they just had to have faith that when they returned, it would be glossy and bright and beautiful. And it was. Seeing kids pull their work out of the pickup bag and watching their eyes go wide with just this joy of rainbow splatters all over a race car model that they painted was awesome. And moms would hype up how superior their brushwork was and just marvel at how bright everything was now. It was typically just a really smiley experience when someone would come to pick their work up. And like every business that's been around long enough, we would get some regulars and we'd also get repeat customers. And I think my favorite repeat was this woman who came in with her two daughters. Mom says, "Hi, we've been here before. We came in with my husband." I said, "Great. If you have any questions, I'm right here to help." And the kid says, "My daddy painted a bowl." "Oh, I remember you all now. You painted a mermaid, you painted a plate, you painted a box. I remember your daddy painting the bowl." And honestly, it wasn't infrequent that I would have absolutely no recollection of people until they told me what they painted. That was how I remembered them. Mom says, "Oh, he uses his bowl every morning." And the daughter chimes in with, "It is his special cereal bowl, and he's the only one that's allowed to use it, and it only gets hand washed." And I remember the father of this adorable little family, and he was just this giant football player of a man. Like, he had arms with muscles bigger than my head. And I remember how engaged he was with his daughters, and he was so inquisitive and so into his project. And just hearing the story of how he used his bowl every day to the point where his kids were bragging on him about it. It was one of those just endearing, heartwarming things that I just, oh my gosh, I relish stories like that when they manage to come back to me. And that's one of the big reasons that pottery drew me in. It's one of the most ancient crafts, and we still use it today. And everyone who uses a mug, they have their favorite mug. There's this really special energy that humans feel when they find their plate or their mug. And they develop a bond with these objects. And in my totally biased opinion, the bond with handmade objects is more powerful because there's a level of customization that caters to each individual's taste when you have pottery. You have people that are able to recognize, that's my cup. You can tell because it has a little wiggle along the handle here. That's my bowl. You can tell because of the little sculpted froggy that's hiding over here. That's my plate. You can tell because of the custom stamped flowers. Now, I grant you, slipcast pottery produces a lot of repeat items. At a Color Me Mine studio, I could always tell when a piece had come from a mold that was about to be retired. The mermaids would have really smooth features, their lips would kind of disappear into their cheeks, whereas the new molds, the mermaids would have clearly defined facial features with lips that were really easy to find. And these pieces are largely made in either overseas factories, or I know there's a large bisque production factories down in Mexico that make these. And so they kind of straddle this weird line between being mass-made and handmade. You have a bowl that was produced in batches of 100, or 1,000. It suddenly becomes this treasured keepsake for someone's morning cereal because they painted it and they customized it and they made it their own. So it's kind of weird, but it's really cool. Okay, and back to what I'm doing. In this video, I've been making cute little hand-built fairy houses, and I intend for these largely to be used as incense burners, but they can also house LED tea lights. I have some people ask if you can put real candles in them, and I'm like, this house is gonna get super hot if you do that. So best to stick to incense or the LED tea lights. Currently with my houses, I have 3 styles. I have little mushrooms, I have little flower tops, and I have leafy tops. Every house has the same size body, which I accomplished by using a 3D printed cutter that I designed. Mushrooms have a little circle cutter for the top. The flower has a custom 3D printed cutter that I also made just for flowers. And for the leafy houses, I go into the backyard and I snatch leaves off of plants to make impressions of them, and then I cut them out. After the houses are dry, I fire them to cone 04. Then I glaze them and they get fired to cone 06, and that's it. My teeny tiny fairy houses are one of my best-selling items, and in my opinion, they're one of the cutest. I've had customers tell me that they put them on their altars, or they hide them in their garden, or they just put them on a prominent shelf. And as a maker, nothing makes me happier or brings me a bigger sense of satisfaction than somebody telling me where my creation gets to live after it's left me. And with that, it's time to leave you. If you're interested in picking up a tiny fairy house, they're available in my shop, Faerie Hive, which is online. The tiny houses are always available online, though some of the mushroom colors I do only put out seasonally. No matter what kind of in-person show I'm doing or what kind of convention I'm at, whether it's more kind of zine and comic oriented or if it's more art and pottery oriented, I always try to have a couple of my teeny tiny houses populating my displays. Links to my shop and social media are in the description. Have a magical day. Bye!